I believe it's the only American who's presenting. I kind of wanted to make the case, not merely the human rights case, but the case as to why I think it's a strategic imperative that India decouples from China. I've heard a lot of good reasons why it's going to be difficult, but I want to make the case as to why there's no other option, right? So kind of for background, so you understand where I'm approaching this from. Back in 1890, Rear Admiral Mahan kind of postulated his theory as to essentially who controls the seas and who controls the choke points controls the world, right? There's the theory that naval power was a defining characteristic of national greatness. Then Mackinder came along. Mackinder said that, you know, who controls kind of the heartland of the world would control the globe, right? And then Spikeman came along in the Geography of Peace, and he said, who controls the Rimland controls Eurasia, and who rules Eurasia controls the destinies of the world. So that's kind of the way that we've been operating, you know, for the past 100 years. We fought 2 world wars over Mackinder's and Spikeman's kind of conception of the world, right? Mahan's choke points today are really more relevant, especially in terms of, you know, how India should be looking at the world. The 2 biggest naval choke points in the world are there right by India, the Strait of Hormuz and the Straits of Malacca, right? When you look at the flow of petroleum that transits the ocean, right? Actually, most of it goes right by India. When we look here at China's strategy, this string of pearls strategy to kind of surround India with this network of ports and bases and you know, listening posts and what have you, we can see that China's trying to box India in, right? We can see the 2 choke points there, and then we can see the port of Gwadar. That kind of shows the oil supply route a little bit better. Now, looking at these choke points, you might think, okay, well, perhaps India has a chance to control the Straits of Malacca, right? And kind of control that choke point and gain the upper hand with China. But we see that with the advent of global warming, the decline of sea ice, right? In the Arctic, new passages are opening up, and China is definitely trying to take advantage of those by asserting itself to be an Arctic power. And you know, they've got their maritime Arctic Silk Road that they're pushing out, and now they're I believe they're building icebreakers, and you know, if not, Russia's building more than enough, right? So India is kind of in a difficult position, and you can see they're playing the submarine game as well. This is not simply about, you know, surface naval warfare or controlling the choke points that way. You know, the Indo-Pacific is teeming with you know, Chinese commercial vessels and probably Chinese submarines underwater, and they're everywhere, right? Now, India's kind of hope in geostrategic terms had been Chabahar, you know, port of Chabahar in India. And the idea was that, you know, essentially India, Iran, and Afghanistan could develop the port of Chabahar and a trade corridor that way, right? And unfortunately, what China has done with the port of Gwadar in occupied Balochistan is quite transparently an effort to project Chinese military power across this critical route, that India was pursuing with Chabahar, with an eye towards what's called anti-access and area denial strategies, right? Basically, limiting India's ability to operate really in its own near waters, right? And now China has announced a mega deal with Iran, which is dimming hopes for Chabahar. And, of course, some people, blame Trump withdrawing from the JCPOA, from the Iran deal, for basically, making giving China that opening with Iran. But I think that's not really the correct way to view it, because this is bound to happen anyway. Returning to the JCPOA will probably only accelerate Iranian-Chinese integration, in my opinion. We can see what China is doing here in its attempts to box India in, no more vividly than with CPEC, right? I'm sure that's at the top of everybody's mind. You can see that it runs from occupied East Turkestan all the way to occupied Balochistan. This has real ramifications for human rights, which is, really the seed of what I care about. Because what China has done in its attempts to block India in is turned East Turkestan into a gulag, right? Giant prison. And I would anticipate that you're going to see that happen all along the CPEC corridor and really anywhere that China goes, because the Chinese Communist Party is by nature an authoritarian, totalitarian regime, which, if it feels that it's not operating, not expanding in a secure environment, it will work with the countries that, it's expanding into to secure that environment. We already see that with Balochistan, the people there, they're being oppressed, I guess would be the nice way to say it. They're not getting the jobs that, they thought would be coming with CPEC. Those are going to imported Chinese labor or, to non-Baloch people, right? So there's not only is there a military imperative, but there's also a human rights imperative here for India to decouple from China, to try to throw up obstacles, throw up a roadblock to China's plans. There's a better example of, kind of what India had hoped it would be able to accomplish, but, with Iran, but those hopes are dimming. Now, we can see, essentially, I mentioned earlier that the A2AD strategy, basically imagine this map, right? This is China's ability to limit access to areas in the East China Sea, South China Sea, right? Now imagine that on the west side of India, right, emanating from the port of Gwadar. That's really what we're talking about here. On top of that, when you look at the rail networks that China is building, India is being really kind of outmaneuvered by China. Sanctions on Iran have reduced the Iran-China trade, which, is good. This is from the Foundation for Defensive Democracies right here. As you look towards a new administration in DC, my perspective would be that returning to the JCPOA will probably not benefit India like some might think it would if America were to do that. But the bottom line here is that China is not a normal country, right? And we shouldn't think about it like a normal country. Modern China, since its founding in 1949, has kind of been built on oppression, really. It's held together by the force of the state. Somebody earlier mentioned a monopoly on violence, and that's really what it is. And that's why we have the situation with Tibet, with East Turkestan. China today is kind of a prison for everybody within its borders. You can see what China is doing is kind of a strategy of combining all of the aforementioned strategies that have defined Western thinking for the past century. And then some of you may be familiar with the book on restricted warfare, which was written by two PLA Air Force colonels, which kind of described in even more detailed terms what China's strategy is, right? It's not just controlling the choke points and trying to take over the land routes to Europe, but it's also doing so through a combination of lawfare and economic warfare and network warfare, and even support for terrorism, or the tacit support for people who do support terrorism at the very least, right? Plus, we mentioned the forced technology transfers, the IP theft, civil military fusion, wartime levels of espionage, massive data collection. It really is a threat unlike the free world has ever seen before, right? And what China is doing now is they're taking that strategy of controlling the choke points in the ocean, right? And they're applying that same strategy to controlling the choke points in cyberspace. And you see that with China's massive build out of fiber around the world, and with their rollout of 5G everywhere, even, sub-Saharan Africa, anywhere you go, there's China pushing 5G, right? And they're doing this because they want to control the choke points for data. Data is the new resource. China's collecting massive amounts of data at the choke points in the cloud. The last speaker mentioned India banning 200 apps, right? And that I audibly cheered when India did that. That India had the guts to do that, and I hope when India's national cybersecurity strategy is released, I believe it's in the final stages of being formulated, that this is really codified in a more concrete way, so that people have no doubt that India is just going to enforce these rules consistently against China, and maybe against Pakistani apps, or whoever it is that might be challenging India's national security, right? China has this advantage due to asymmetric access to the free world's data. They lock their data behind the Great Firewall, but we give it away for free. America does, India does, we all do. We give it to social networks like Google and Facebook. We give it to credit unions. We give it to data brokers, right? There are huge companies that people have never heard of, which are collecting, aggregating, collating all of our data, right? Whether it's from, surveys that you fill out online to, cookies on websites that you visit, right? And these data brokers, they build these profiles in consumers, and then they sell them. And part of the problem is that we don't know who they sell this data to. And they might think that they're selling it to, you know, Americans, Europeans, or Indians, or whatever, but because we don't have insight into their operations, they could be selling our data to China. We just don't know. Making matters worse, China is also collecting genetic data via companies like BGI, the Beijing Genomics Institute. BGI is, you know, they're operating in Pakistan. They're operating everywhere since, you know, COVID, since the pandemic. BGI has been expanding its footprint all around the globe, right? From Pakistan to Israel to, again, to Ethiopia, right? BGI is there. California, right? They're trying to sell their genetic, their virus screening kits all over the world, right? And that poses a real risk because that data, that genetic data, has uses. Now, when we look at kind of the global market for the global cloud computing market, we can see that China's got two big players right up there. And, you know, you might think, oh, 5%, 2%, okay, well, that's nothing to worry about. But the thing to understand here is that each of these clouds, these other ones, you know, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, IBM, these are actually a collection of clouds. Cloud providers contract with data center owners and infrastructure owners, and China is contracting with those same data centers and same infrastructure providers, right? And that poses a risk as well, because you don't want Alibaba or Tencent to have access to the same data center that your Google data or your Microsoft data is in, right? You don't want China to have any access to that. And so this is an area where America is just kind of barely getting with the program. We've been doing good in kind of addressing this threat head on, but you know, there's still some facets of it which we've not really come to terms with yet.
Mr. Olbert, Mr. Olbert, can I request you to hasten up your presentation, because we can cover some of the subjects that you're mentioning, as it's a very interesting, and I mean, there's so many insights already from this, but as we are slightly short on time, can I request you to kind of just go through it a bit quickly, please?
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
So all of this data, the bottom line here is that all of this data, China can use it for all of the purposes I mentioned, plus for training AI. And all of this data has dual use purposes. There are legitimate civilian uses, also there are military uses. We've seen that with the Xinhua data leaks, right? China's been collecting data on TikTok, on Reddit, on warships, on politically exposed people. And unless India moves to decouple, India is going to fall into the same trap. So why should we do this? Well, I mean, the good news is that, you know, sovereign wealth funds have given India a vote of confidence. But the way that I would encourage you to think about this is that in 1996, IBM AI built, IBM was able to beat, right, a human chess player in 1996. Then in 2015, Google was able to do that with the Chinese game of Go, right? Computer is able to beat a human. Things are accelerating. Now imagine, India, that you are playing the game of Risk or Monopoly versus a Chinese quantum computer. They've already figured out what your next moves are. In 1983, there was a game, or there's a movie. It was called War Games, and kind of the end of the movie was that the AI realized that the only winning move is not to play, right? And that's what I would encourage you all to think about, is that, you know, as difficult as it might be, the best option is to decouple, to not play China's games.